Okay, well, one of the things that happens when people get to hear that you're doing a lecture series like this is people start giving you things to read or to... So I'm going to start with this. It's really brilliant. This is entitled New in Theatres, Early Man. 2 cavemen must mobilize against an invading Bronze Age force in this Aardman Animations family comedy. So, I don't know whether that's art imitating history or what, but you can go and see this in Burlington if you haven't got anything better. If you haven't got anything better to do, what?
It's a Whallonsburg Grange.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be really cool, but it's about Bronze Age. I don't know what it's about. Anyway. This is the second lecture. Those of you who were here last week know we talked a bit about the Neolithic Revolution, the beginnings of agricultural society, the first towns, first larger settlements. So what I want to start today is by looking at a couple of major further advances in agricultural productivity, and to talk a little bit about some of the consequences of those advances for society in general. So what I'm going to be talking about is the Bronze and Iron Age technologies. The top illustration, and I love these modern. These are modern reconstructions of Bronze and Iron Age tools, and I kind of really like them because they look really sharp. I mean, that's a somewhat facetious point, but I mean it. I mean, you often see these old tools and they don't really look like very much. But that sickle really looks as though you could do some serious work with it. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. That this was an advance in tool technology. Previously, of course, we've had various degrees of sophistication in stone tools, and now suddenly, or over a period of time, we have the development of metal tools. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Tin particularly is quite rare, so bronze tools relatively limited circulation, but iron much more common once the techniques of metalworking, which require hotter temperatures, had been developed. So Bronze Age technology, Bronze Age tools emerge in Western Eurasia, modern day Turkey, Anatolia, maybe about 3,300 BCE. A couple of hundred years later, we have the first evidence in the Yellow River area of China, the beginnings of bronze working in China, probably by a process of diffusion, trade and diffusion across Eurasia, but there's also undoubtedly processes of conquest going on as well. Gets to Britain, for example, about 2,500 BCE. That's about 800 years or so after the beginnings of bronze technology. So this is pretty rapid spread of Bronze Age tools. The Iron Age begins about 2,000 years after the beginning of the Bronze Age, about 1300 BCE. Between then and about 1000, archaeologists refer to as Iron 1 or Iron Age 1, which is when bronze and iron tools would have both been in use. From about 1000 BCE, Iron Age 2, the iron tools are predominant. So, basic technological advances. I want to say a little bit about the significance of these. I made the point, sharper, hold an edge longer, resharpenable. Great advance in agricultural productivity. In other words, how much work one farmer can accomplish in a given period of time, how much crop one farmer can harvest in a given period of time, how much ploughing one farmer can do in a given period of time, or another way of looking at the same fact, how many farmers are needed to support a given population. In other words, we're going to see a significant leap in a couple of significant leaps in agricultural productivity, enabling smaller populations of farmers to support larger populations of non-farmers. I talked a little bit in the last class about the pyramid. We're used to, our modern society, a huge number of non-farmers resting ultimately on a tiny number of farmers, and we're by the time we get to the Iron Age, Bronze Age, we're starting to move in that direction. I say that cautiously. The great majority of people are still farming in this period. In fact, the great majority of people are still going to be farming into the 20th century. So I don't get too carried away with the pace of the transition, but that transition is beginning. So we have sharper, more resilient tools, better adapted to specific tasks, axes, scythes, hoes, all designed for specific purposes. Iron, the development of iron working, and of course the alloys of iron, steel alloys in particular, have even greater impact. These are more generally available. People are more willing to make agricultural tools out of them. A lot of bronze is going to be used by the elites for swords and spears and armor, stuff like that. By the time we get to iron, a lot more iron is going to be used in farming tools. The image on the right here is from a little bit later, from medieval Europe, but a huge advance in plough technology. Previously, ploughs had basically been a wooden stick dragged through, or often by a person, dragged through the dirt, and now we get metal-tipped ploughs with a mold board, which is turning the soil over as well as cutting it. So big advance in plough technology, big advance in how much work one plough person can do in any given period of time. One aspect of the increasing productivity we don't necessarily often think of, cooking. The availability of metal cooking pots meant that you could make a stew, for example, leave a stew boiling all day, which had been very, very difficult with pottery. It tends to shatter if you leave it on the fire for too long. So less time spent in cooking, more time spent doing other things. So these advances in tool technology, combined with some other developments, we start to see the emergence of more sophisticated irrigation techniques, particularly in the great river valleys. I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute. The Mesopotamia, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River, prone to annual flooding, and now around the same time, 3000 or so BCE, we start to get that flooding being harnessed, water being channeled to distribute it over wide networks of fields far from the actual river. So big advance in irrigation. This also demands a higher level of social organization. You've got to organize a lot of people into construction projects of this kind. So greater surplus labor, greater organization of surplus labor. Right around the same time, the domestication of the horse, also in Western Eurasia, maybe about 3500 BCE. So it's all in that same period. First of all, horses are going to be used primarily for transport, for military means. later, of course, for agricultural, for pulling plows. Although it actually takes a remarkably long time to develop a horse harness that doesn't basically choke the horse if it's trying to pull a heavy plow like this. So that's not quite as rapid as you might imagine, but nevertheless, the domestication of the horse is part of this overall process. So new metal technologies, irrigation, the domestication of the horse, all of a piece. And not surprisingly, I talked last week a little bit about the beginnings of the impact, the anthropogenic impact of human beings on the environment. Very thin to begin with, fire basically, and now of course we're getting a much thicker human impact on the environment. Large scale clearance of forests in some places, drainage. Often we're going to see mudslides, that sort of thing, beginning. So much larger scale human impact. Of course, the clearing of the forest is also going to have a significant impact on the carbon sequestration and other things. I'll talk about those, I think, a little bit in a later lecture. So these developments, at least in terms of iron, this is polycentric. This is not just one place. The evidence, I think, now is pretty conclusive that iron working develops autonomously in sub-Saharan Africa, in West Africa. This is a modern-day iron furnace, smelting furnace from West Africa. The same technology's basically been in use for whatever, 5,000 years or so, and no bronze. So tool development in Africa going directly from stone to iron tools. The bottom illustration, the so-called Bantu migrations. I would say still fairly rudimentary understanding of this. This is a language group originating in West Africa, modern-day Nigeria, Ghana, and diffusing southwards across Africa, beginning in about 3000 BCE, so beginning in about this period, and of course you can see crossing the tropical rainforest belt in Central Africa, the capacity to cut down large trees, the capacity to turn heavy soils, the usefulness of metal tooling, iron tooling, to facilitate this process of migration. Interestingly, the ratio of people to land in Africa remains relatively low. We don't see any larger state-level societies in sub-Saharan Africa until Grand Zimbabwe in the south of Africa, about 400 CE, which by the way, I'm using CE and BCE in place of BC and AD. It's a convention to use the same numbering system but de-Christianize it. I think it's appropriate for world history in dealing with societies that are not Christian in religious belief. But when I say CE, you can think AD, if you want. Think whatever you like, but okay. So in other parts of both East and West Eurasia, however, advances in tool technology do lead. We talked a little bit about that inflection point in the world population graph last week. Do lead to rising population densities and are very much intertwined with the emergence of city-states. I want to spend a few minutes and talk about the city-states. Both words are important. Both sides of the formula are important. These are cities, concentrations of population, larger than the town level societies. We talked a little bit in the last class. We're talking several thousand people. We're talking increased specialization. Sometimes we're going to find entire districts of tool makers or basket weavers and specific crafts, manufacturing centers, as well as political and military centers. So cities, the development of city entities. The second part of the formulation, states, and I'm using this in a political or sociological manner to talk about a set of institutions that emerge to defend and consolidate the wealth and the social organization of the emerging class societies that we described, that we talked a little bit about in the Neolithic Revolution. So by the time we get to the early Bronze Age, social classes are becoming pretty well defined. The elite are separating out from the majority of society, and the states that they create, the city-states that they preside over, are institutions that are designed to maintain, perpetuate, and defend those relations. So when we talk about city-states, it's important to think about cities and the concept of a state. I want to talk a little bit about some of the characteristics. Hereditary monarchies. So here's King Sargon of Akkad over on the right there, one of the first multi-city empires I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. But hereditary monarchies, the passage of monarchy, the passage of kingship in families, through the male line, if at all possible. So this is one of the defining features of these state level societies. Sophisticated administrative machines. We're often going to find trained scribes, people who go to school for some period, often many years, to learn to read, to write, to produce the clay tablets in which record keeping is going to be done. So a professional administration. Often this is going to run in the family, so we're going to get scribal families over many generations. The recording of taxes. So we've got a state, we've got a solidifying ruling class, we've got the levying of taxes, particularly on the peasant populations. We're usually being paid in kind. In other words, they're paying in grain or in rice or whatever the main commodity they're growing. That's been stored in government granaries. The scribes are recording how much is brought in. A lot of these early clay tablets are simply recording what comes in and what goes out of state-run, government-run granaries. So record keeping, literacy, numeracy. Right along with this, the top left-hand illustration, this is one of the stone pillars around the Babylonian kingdom of Hammurabi, on which are inscribed the laws of the state. And these are beautiful. These are 6 or 8 feet tall, and they were literally in villages throughout the kingdom. Unfortunately, Babylonian laws had got a bad rap. Probably all you know about is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That is in there, okay. But out of the 300 laws that are inscribed on these tablets, 2/3 of them deal with business transactions of various kinds. They deal with family relations. They deal with how you get a divorce. If you're a man, if you're a woman, if your wife's sleeping with another guy, anyway, it's very complicated. It's extremely complicated law, but it all favors the man. I mean, no big surprise, right? But think about what we were talking about last week about the emergence of the declining status of women in the Neolithic period. So here we get to the early Bronze Age. This is codified in law, written down law, defining the inequality of men and women, defining the inequality of social classes. The main classes of Babylonian society, the king and the nobles at the top, free men, most of them small farmers, and then slaves. They all have different legal rights. The eye for an eye is a tooth for a tooth only applies to people of the same class. If you put out the eye of someone of a higher class than you, the chances are you're going to be killed. If you put out the eye of someone of a lower class than you, the chances are you're going to be able to pay us some amount in some relatively small fine and get away with it. Legally inscribed in social inequality. Legally inscribed gender inequality built into this. It's also interesting, this is all for legal scholars, this is all case law. In other words, they didn't start by sitting down and saying, what's our law on divorce going to be? And they have a big, long debate and they write it. And it's not like this is not a parliamentary system. This is a system of case law where people bring their case to Hammurabi. Hammurabi literally gives a judgment, and the judgment becomes codified as law. So we have law being built from the bottom up in that sense. I didn't put a slide here, but this is also the era we see the beginning of science as gradually separating out fields of inquiry, astronomy, in particular, the beginnings of medicine, and I mentioned it in the last lecture, math. Some wonderful new tablets being discovered, basically giving a Pythagorean triangle, and there's a lot of debate amongst archaeologists about anyway. I'm not going to bore you with the debate, but that's basically what it is, a 3, 4, 5 triangle. Okay, now I'm going to get to the controversial bit. The other thing that got raised, particularly during and after the last lecture, the question of religion. So, here, state-level society, we see for the first time the codification of organized religion. I'm not talking about general religious beliefs. They clearly emerge a lot earlier with behaviorally modern Homo sapiens. We talked about that in the previous class. But organized religion. Here's Hammurabi. The image on the left is actually from the top of one of those stone plinths with the stone stele with the laws inscribed on it. In case anyone was in any doubt, the laws are Hammurabi is empowered to make these judgments, legal judgments, because he is directly appointed by God or by the god of the city. This is Shamash, one of the main deities of ancient Babylon, handing him the insignia of legal office. And we're going to see the formation of priesthoods, like the scribes that we already talked about. This is often going to be passed from generation to generation, whose job it is, and I'm going to crudify this now, whose job it is to come up with the explanations and justifications of the existing social order. In other words, how come you're a peasant or a slave? How come the king's the king? Doesn't that seem a little bit unfair? Obviously not, because it's all prescribed and religiously justified. Okay, here's the controversial. That's not controversial. Here's the controversial bit. I do not think that religion, got to be real careful how I say this stuff. I do not think that religion is I don't think we're going to see much evidence. That's a good way of doing it. But I don't think we're going to see much evidence of religion acting as an independent variable, as an independent factor in global history. I think we're going to see a lot of people motivated to do things for what they consider to be religious reasons. But I don't think we're going to see a lot of religion actually being the main motive force. We're going to see a lot of religion. We're going to see a lot of religion that takes shape from the bottom up. We're going to see a lot of religion that justifies rebellion against the existing order. And we're going to see a lot of ways in which those religions that begin by justifying rebellion against the existing order become assimilated into justifications for the existing order. So we're going to see a lot of religion. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but we're going to see a lot of religion. But I don't think we're going to see it serving as an independent variable, an independent factor. It's a product of given set of social and economic political circumstance, and as it is in the way that it emerges here, and becomes, and I put in, and I'll say a little bit about the Aztec and Mesoamerica in a minute, but very similar. I mean, this is happening later time-wise for obvious reasons. The Americas are settled later, but as we get to the emergence of city-level societies in Mesoamerica, we're also going to see actually extremely. I mean, we're talking about human sacrifices, sometimes of thousands of people in a day. I mean, really codified, highly organized. State level religions. Okay. So we've got all of these things resting on this two-part advance, Bronze Age and Iron Age advance in agricultural productivity, leading to the development of the first state-level societies. The other institution, which I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about, that emerges at this same time is the army, is armed forces. In the Bronze Age, the archetypal military expression of the Bronze Age states is going to be the fast horse-drawn chariot. And I put at the left here, bottom left, here's Achilles with receiving his weapons from the gods. Think of Troy. Think of the Greek Bronze Age warrior culture. There's one expression of it. The map, starting in about 2000 in Central Eurasia, you're going to see a diffusion of chariot technology, Bronze Age chariot technology, particularly into the Middle East, into Anatolia, into Egypt, into China by about 1600 BCE, into northern India, and into Europe. So a very broad diffusion. This is Bronze Age. These are Bronze Age societies. These are the weapons of the elite, a militarized elite. The majority of the the majority of the population might get turned out to defend their city or something like that. But by and large, they're not permanently organized for combat. But you have highly militarized elites. Again, think of Homer. Think of Greek Bronze Age Greek society. Body armor, shields, swords, bronze weapons. Iron is going to transform this. Iron, much more common, I made the point before, much less elite, therefore, and we're going to see the armies of the great Iron Age empires are primarily infantry armies. That's to say, these are not armies of the elite. They're led by the elite, to be sure, but the actual soldiers are going to be often conscripted peasants or urban workers. Often they're going to do 25 years of service in the Roman army, something like that. Metal body armor, the wonderful Qin dynasty, the terracotta soldiers, although some American tourists, some of you I know just saw this, managed to take a selfie in front of them, I mean yesterday or the day before, and broke the thumb off one of these, so I don't know what that's an advert for, but not American youth. leather armor, but riveted with iron rivets. You're seeing the not only development in metal technology, but also the development in agricultural surplus. By the time we get to the Iron Age that we're talking about, 1000 BCE, somewhere around that period, a large surplus population that does not need to be permanently engaged in farming, people who can be full-time employed as soldiers. We get state production, state-run factories producing weapons, so they're all the same, give or take, both in the Roman Empire and in Han China. We get separate barracks. Soldiers are going to live apart from the civilian population. We're going to try and reduce their contact with the civilian population in case we need to use them against the civilian population. They're going to be disciplined. They're going to drill. The terracotta army, Qin dynasty terracotta army, arrayed in order of battle, rank and file. I mean, you're very used to thinking of armies marching in that sort of way, but this is when this emerges historically. Organized units, military drill, centralized command structures, all of this emerges. Okay, so I want to say a little bit, I've talked about some of the characteristics, I want to talk a little bit about how and where these states emerge. So here's the first Bronze Age river valley civilizations, beginning in Mesopotamia, in the valley of the Tigris and the Euphrates. The first city-states about 3,500 BCE, and then we're going to see a series of Bronze Age empires following that. I'm not going to try and describe them, the Babylonian, the Assyrian. We don't need to go into the details. To the right, over the through the Indus Valley of India, the Harappa civilization, the least known. We have some archaeological evidence. We have no decipherable language, rises and falls, and it's still a great deal of mystery. The Yellow River, the Shang dynasty, and then in China, and old Egypt, Old Kingdom Egypt in the Nile Valley. So this is the first sort of wave of the cities of the Bronze Age. They beginning as city-states and then larger imperial states, multi-city political organization. Cosmopolitan worlds. In other words, these are not just discrete societies, these are societies that are trading to broader hinterlands. The Shang dynasty there, the first Bronze Age Chinese kingdom, Chinese dynasty, trading into the South China Sea, to Korea, into Manchuria, into Mongolia, land and sea trade in the Mediterranean. Ships like this, beautiful reconstruction from the coast from the Turkish coast, trading throughout the eastern Mediterranean, oil, olive oil, wine, all kinds of other products through the eastern Mediterranean. I don't have a specific illustration, but trade from Mesopotamia, from the southern tip, from the Persian Gulf, along the coast to India, back and forth in the Indian Ocean. So the beginnings in this Bronze Age period, I say cosmopolitan worlds, people with similar outlook, people with similar expectations and lives in different civilizations, in different areas, beginning to be connected by networks of trade. And then, about 1200, we're going to see this comes to a screeching halt. This is the crisis and collapse of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. You can see here the Assyrian Empire in the green, the Hittites in Anatolia, the New Kingdom Egypt in the yellow. So this is the end of that Bronze Age period, and the extension via trade of those cultures into the Greek peninsula, the Mycenaean era of Greek history, or the Greek Bronze Age. Within a couple of hundred years, every major city in the eastern Mediterranean is burnt to the ground. Think Troy. This is the historic period in which the sack of Troy takes place, the end of Bronze Age Greece. Big debate back and forth between archaeologists and historians about why this happens. How much of it is invasion? The Egyptians talk a lot about the sea people, but we don't really know. We don't really know. We know large imperial societies, Bronze Age societies, warrior cultures, chariot base, all of that stuff I've been describing. We know it ends pretty darn quickly. We know the Indus society collapses pretty darn quickly, although we know even less about the details. So I want to sort of suggest an explanation to think about. I sort of touched on this last week, but you see patterns here in which the growth of the state, the growth of the state apparatus, the growth of the wealth of the elites, their desire for more wealth, overwhelms the productive capacity of their societies, and renders them vulnerable to invasion and revolt, peasant revolts. So we have, if you like, a sort of social overreach of levels of sophistication and wealth that cannot be sustained at that existing level of agricultural productivity. We're talking the Bronze Age here, so we know that given a few hundred years, we're going to get that increase in agricultural productivity. We're going to get iron. We're going to get the emergence of more productive agricultural technologies and the capacity to support larger imperial states. Of course, they didn't know that. For them, this is just the end of the world. I mean, this is the end of. I mean, in Greece they call it in Greek history. This is the Greek Dark Ages. That follows the sudden collapse of these societies. Okay, I want to just make a sort of digression, but I think a useful one. This is really parallel to what happens in Mesoamerica. Again, it's hard to do these slides because stuff just develops so quickly. Some of you may have seen these wonderful, amazing new LiDAR, ground-penetrating radar images that have come out in the last few weeks of Mayan cities. This one happens to be in modern-day Guatemala. But these are in dense jungle, impenetrable jungle, that we now, through LiDAR imagery, can create pretty sophisticated images. This is, you can see the middle left here, a pyramid, monumental pyramid, probably human sacrifice, and the grid system. This is just a part of a small, population of 100,000, 120,000 people. I mean, huge cities. In Mayan society, and of course ones we're a little bit more familiar with, Teotihuacan, just literally at the edge of modern day Mexico City, about 125,000 people at its maximum. I mean, gigantic cities. So these look really. I should have put the image of the first city-states in Mesopotamia, the ziggurat, the stone pyramidical structures. They look really similar. I mean, they look really similar. When I was a kid, there was a guy, Eric von Daniken, some of you probably remember him. I mean, total nut job, but maybe I can't say that now, it's all on film, but anyway. You know, basically the only way this was possible was the spaceman had been here and blah, blah, blah. And, it was kind of convincing for an hour or two. But anyway, these look really similar. But they look really similar because they are really similar. There's a lot of common elements. These are city-states, like the city-states in Mesopotamia, with class divisions, with clear-cut social stratification, with a highly sophisticated elite, with the beginnings of literacy and numerous, I mean, all the stuff. I mean, organized games, sports field, ballparks, all kinds of stuff. And the point I was making about the human sacrifice earlier, organized religion. Declining status of women, it's all in there. Every piece of it is in there. But there's a pattern here which is a little bit different. Three waves of historical development. The so-called pre-classical, from about 1500 BCE to about 200 BCE. The Olmec in the Yucatan, the Chavin in the Andes. The classical period, kind of overlapping about 400 to about 1000 CE, so into the Common Era. Some of the sites here, the Maya sites in southern Mexico, Guatemala, that we've just been talking about. Thirdly, the post-classical. The most famous, the Aztec Empire, at the height of it, really still at the height of its power, when the European conquistadors arrive in about in the early 1500s. So we have a succession of city-states that emerge, large, highly organized, big urban populations, clear class divisions, religion, etc. All of these features, and then collapse. How do you expand the agricultural productivity to break out of that cycle? So instead of grow, overbear your agricultural base, collapse, lie fallow for a few hundred years, grow, overbear your base, collapse again. How do you break out of that? Well, the Aztec have a pretty good shot at it. They have very sophisticated agriculture. They have floating gardens, water gardens. They have copper tools. Copper, you really need tin to make it into bronze. Copper's kind of bendy, so not that great, but better than stone. They have obsidian tools. Dragon glass, as we now see if you watch Game of Thrones. Volcanic glass tools. Actually more used in knives and weapons than in agricultural tools. And they expand, create a massive empire across a whole swath of modern-day central Mexico, which basically consists of enslaving other towns, other city-states, and forcing them to provide food for the Aztec. The main tribute is not in gold. The main tribute paid by these city-states that the Aztec conquer is food. So here's the attempt to break out of that cycle by significantly raising agricultural productivity. We'll never know whether it would work or not, because it's intersected by the arrival of the Europeans, and we get into a whole different evolution takes place. But I think it's unlikely. I think it's unlikely without hard metals, without iron, without bronze. I think it's unlikely without large mammals to provide tractive power, that you're going to see the levels of productivity increase that you need to sustain or to break out of that pattern. Anyway, that can't be proved one way or another, but you can see how the parallels here, I think, are really interesting. I mean, if you think about these collapses and think about them as a parallel to the Bronze Age collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean I was talking about before, I mean, they're not the same, but a similar historical phenomenon, or the collapse of the Indus Valley society, for example. Why do these patterns take place? Okay. Okay, just a couple of small observations. Following the collapse of the cosmopolitan world, the Bronze Age cultures in the Eastern Mediterranean, we're going to get a little moment when there's no big predator states around, no big imperial states around. This is the moment of the Kingdom of Israel, which in the top right here, divides and then is basically swallowed up by the next new big Iron Age empire. Now we're talking about the Neo-Assyrians, and at the bottom here, same period, the emergence of the Phoenicians, again from the Eastern Mediterranean, trading throughout the Mediterranean. In particular, founding the city of Carthage in modern-day Tunis, and the bottom strip, the first alphabetic language. So we have the beginnings of monotheistic religion in the Mediterranean, in Israel, and we have the beginnings of written language, of alphabetic language. So that little interregnum between the collapse of the Bronze Age empires and the rise of the Iron Age empires is really important. What we're going to see then is the emergence of and I'm not going to try and go through this in any detail, is a series of ever larger Iron Age empires in the Eastern Mediterranean. In particular, the one you know best, I'm sure, the Persian Empire, Achaemenid Persian Empire. We're talking about 550 BCE, and gigantic territory from the Eastern Mediterranean all the way to the Indus River on the border of India, and we're seeing how do you organize territory that large? New innovations in empire organization, provinces, governors of provinces sent out from the central government to administer a province. They're not going to be able to stay there very long. We don't want them building up too much power in the region, so we're going to move them around like good civil servants. Road network, so we can improve communications. We can respond quickly to any rebellion in some part of the empire. Common laws throughout the entirety of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Common weights and measures. And a capacity to assimilate elite. So in other words, we're not the guys before, the Neo-Assyrians, their way of dealing with people who they conquer is basically to haul them off into captivity. That's what happens, as you all know, to the Israelites. How come they end up in Babylon? But the Persians, much more sophisticated, they are going to find ways of assimilating the conquered elites into their state structure, and in particular, they're going to do it through religion. But the Zoroastrian religion, another great monotheistic religion. in the Middle East. Becomes the unifying ideological force of the Persian Empire. Okay. You're all going to know, of course, what happens in the western end of. I think I've got a little pointer here. Let's see if this thing works. So I'm talking about the Aegean coast of Turkey now. These are Greek settlements, these are Greek cities, but they're under Persian rule. They rebel against Persia. The Persians don't like it very much, and they launch a massive invasion of Greece to try and put an end to the troublesome Greeks. As you can see, Greece is not very big and important part of the Persian world. I mean, it really is stuck right out on the end of the Persian world. Nevertheless, that's the part that we know most about, because it's the heroic Greek resistance and all that kind of stuff, right? But nevertheless, it's important what's going to happen there. I'm just going to take a minute and talk about that. While this is going on, the Greeks have come up with a wonderful new innovation. It's not democracy, it's not philosophy, it's not the citizen soldier, although they're going to have all those things. It's chattel slavery in production. Don't like to think about the classical Greeks like that, but nevertheless, this is the foundation of Greek political and social and ideological success. It's not true anywhere else in the Middle East. There's some domestic slavery, there's certainly domestic slavery in Persia, but there's very little slave production. That's using slaves to actually grow things, or in the case of Greece, to mine. The Greek mines are run by slaves, they're extremely productive, they basically work them to death, and huge increase in productivity. It means a whole bunch of Greeks can sit around on their butts all day doing nothing better than talk about the meaning of life. I mean, I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up. The relationship between the modes of economic activity and the cultural and ideological and political superstructures is absolutely clear here. That Greek democracy, Greek philosophy, Greek art and culture go hand in hand with Greek slavery. Go absolutely hand in hand with it. Classical Greece begins in 480 BCE with the defeat of the defeat of the Persians. Well, it ends in a fratricidal civil war amongst the Greeks not very long afterwards, and by the conquest of Greece by another bunch of semi-barbarians, the Macedonians, another Iron Age army, takes over Greece, and Alexander the Great, the son of Philip, who actually conquers Greece, sets off on another world-conquering mission. And again, you can see this is a Greek army. So you can see the power of military power of what's been put together in that period of classical Greece. Alexander's literally going to march right across from the Nile to the Indus, overthrow the Persian Empire, establish a new Greek empire, basically. Well, it doesn't last beyond Alexander's death. Alexander dies in 323 BCE. The empire literally immediately fragments into these separate parts: the Seleucids, the Ptolemaic, etc., etc. The Ptolemaic are going to rule Egypt until Cleopatra and the arrival of the Romans a couple of hundred years later. But Greek or Hellenic culture diffused throughout this region. We have a sort of intermingling of Persian and Greek culture throughout this entire vast area. Diffusion of Greek philosophy and culture to some extent. Trade, religious exchange. This is very. I'll say more about trade in the next lecture. Spills into India, when Alexander the Great's army arrives on the border of India, on the Indus River, a young guy, Chandragupta Maurya, observes the Greek tactics, he copies them, and lays the basis of the first great Indian empire, unified Indian empire. We're going to see a pattern in Indian empires of conquest from the north southwards. In other words, you get control of the Indus and Ganges valleys, the really fertile parts of India, and then you advance southwards from there. So an Indian empire of a couple of hundred years is a sort of spin-off from this. Okay, so just to draw some of this together. And I want to just say a little bit about slavery as I do that. So now to conclude, I'm going to talk about the two final great Iron Age empires, Rome in the western end of Eurasia, and a little bit about Han China in the east. The dynamism of the Roman Empire, the conquest capacity of the Roman Empire comes from its slave base of production. In the Italian peninsula, in Hispania, in Gallia, modern-day Spain and France, in the establishment of gigantic slave plantations, which in the short term, and I stress that, in the short term, give you an enormous boost in agricultural productivity that allows you to allows them to leverage that into a machine of military conquest that is able to subjugate the entire rim of the Mediterranean basin. Only time it's ever been done. In the east, they conquer what had been Hellenic Greek societies in Anatolia and in Egypt, the Ptolemaic regime in Egypt, and so on. And so these are already highly urbanized societies, very sophisticated, literate elites, and big peasant agriculture. Free peasants, heavily taxed but free. The Romans never tried to impose slavery on the conquered territories in the eastern Mediterranean because it would have meant overthrowing the existing elites. And they know the way to build a vast empire is to assimilate the Egyptians and the Anatolians and so on and so forth. So from the beginning, the Roman Empire has a kind of is based on slavery in the West, and based on urban Hellenic society, peasant societies in the East. That, of course, we'll talk a little bit more about that this next week. That's going to, in many ways, govern the fate of the two parts of the empire, the collapse of the Western Empire and the longevity of the Eastern so-called Byzantine Empire in the East. But by the time you get to Rome, all of those techniques, appointing governors, rotating them, an army which you can deploy from one end. I mean, this is an unbelievably level of military sophistication, that you can deploy units, legions, auxiliary forces from one end of the empire to the other. You can put them on a boat in Egypt and you can ship them to... And this is brilliant. I talked about the DNA evidence a little bit. Cheddar, by the way, is a place. We talked about Cheddar Man a little bit, and you just thought I meant a ball of cheese or something. But it is actually a place in England. I raise that, I come back to that because the DNA... The more DNA testing that's been done in England today is how many of the English from this period of Egyptian, North African, Anatolian, the Roman army. The Roman army was not an army of white people. I mean, it had an Italian core, but they weren't that white either. The mobilization of these forces, their deployment across the... So in many ways, this is the height of the sophistication of the Iron Age Empire, the capacity to assimilate ruling classes, and, absolutely brilliantly, state religion, Christianity. The transformation of Christianity from a religion of the oppressed, a religion of the oppressed in ancient Judea, into the state religion of the Roman Empire, which is what it becomes after Constantine in 325. They had to have a big council at Nicaea because there were so many brands of Christianity running around out there. I mean, so many competing views of what should be included and what shouldn't, and what real Christian doctrine was. They had to get it clear, because once you make it a state religion, it has a function. So I'm afraid the Gospel of Mary gets tossed out, and the Gospel, there's all kinds of, I mean, some of you I'm sure have studied this stuff. Gospel of Thomas, yeah, they all have Gospels. There's loads of them. But now you've got to decide which are the ones which are going to be canonical, which are going to become, because religion is now going to serve a different function. Okay, very, very, very finally, you'll be pleased to know, other end of Eurasia, very parallel development, parallel in time frame, parallel in scope, geographic scope, begins with the Qin dynasty, the terracotta guys you saw before, but is very quickly followed by the Han. 400 years more of a single Chinese dynasty. Population rises to about 50 million. Same as Rome, give or take. I mean, these are two gigantic centralized population concentrations at either end of Eurasia. I'll talk a little bit in the next seminar about the connections between them. Right? No big surprise here, right? Rising agricultural productivity. You're going to get bored with me saying this. Rising agricultural productivity. The beginnings of the systematic cultivation of rice in the Yangtze Valley there's no slavery in Han China. Well, that's not totally true. There's personal slaves, domestic slaves, but there's no slave production in Han China. This is all free peasants, heavily taxed peasantry. Iron tools, seed drills, irrigation techniques, the whole thing. Infantry, army, the terracotta army we talked about before. Professional administration, first civil service exam in history. The height of achievement in Han China is to become a civil servant. You study for 7 or 8 or 10 years. You've got to master all the Confucian classics. You've got to sit an exam, highly competitive exam. And those who make it get into the civil service and live very good lives. Unified ideology, Confucianism, not a religious ideology, but a political ideology. Military expansionism, Korea, Vietnam, and of course westward along the lines. You can see the brown area spreading towards the Taomid Basin there. Along the lines of what becomes the Silk Road, pushing Chinese control out into Central Asia. So these two mighty empires, the last of the great Iron Age empires. We'll talk about some of the commonalities, common challenges between them a little bit next week. But let's finish the lecture there and maybe take a few questions. So I covered an awful lot of ground there. I hope you didn't. I hope you more or less stayed with me. So we'll find out in the questions, I guess. So thanks a lot.